Yeah. It's on wheels, so. Yeah, there's horses. They copy like halfway, they tap
That's why they're there, probably.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Stephanie Lin. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, for those who don't know me. And tonight marks the second lecture of our double feature lecture series featuring Jimenez Lai Bureau Spectacular, based in Los Angeles. This follows a really inspiring presentation last night from JA Architecture Studio, Behnaz Asadi and Nima Javidi, who are in the audience with us as well. They're based in Toronto, and they delivered a great lecture at Kosanti yesterday. So I mentioned yesterday that this just happens, this is coincidental. It just happens to be our most Canadian lecture series to date. But tonight we've outdone ourselves, and we are welcoming a proportionally very large Canadian audience as well from the University of Toronto, who've been touring around Arizona. So welcome to Arcosanti. Thank you for joining us. Arcosanti is a place where serendipitous encounters do happen quite a lot, but the probability of this many Torontonians in one room is really low, and as a fellow Canadian, I'm very excited about this. So Jimenez Lai was born in Taiwan, grew up in Canada, and lives in Los Angeles. Before establishing Bureau Spectacular, he lived in a desert shelter at Taliesin West and resided in a shipping container at Atelier Van Lieshout on the piers of Rotterdam. Lai's first book, Citizens of No Place, an architectural graphic novel, was published by Princeton Architectural Press with a grant from the Graham Foundation. He's won various awards, including the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects, the debut award at the Lisbon Triennale, and the designer of the future at Art Basel. And he represented Taiwan at the 14th Venice Architecture Biennale. Jimenez and I met in 2017 through that year's MoMA PS1 Young Architects competition, and have been crossing paths ever since, mainly through teaching and reviews. Many know, as I just mentioned, that Jimenez spent a year in 2004 living between Taliesin and Taliesin West, our school's former locations, doing the migration from Wisconsin to Arizona, and living in a student-built outdoor shelter in the Arizona desert. The shelter is an almost 90-year-old school tradition that has continued through the decades, and most recently has become the student design-build thesis at TSOA. And a couple of our students are engaging in that process right now, Christopher and Tristan. So you'll see more of that as the semester progresses. But not everyone knows that the TSOA experience creates very particular bonds and familial connections, as one recent alum reiterated at yesterday's lecture. And whether you're looking for it or not, these connections exist. It's a shared learning experience, kind of unlike any other, characterized by deep connections to design and craft, the natural landscape, and living and learning among a unique and intimate community. Tonight, Jimenez will present the built and unbuilt stories that comprise his wide-ranging body of design work. I'm excited to welcome him back to this latest iteration of the school as one and possibly a recurring stop in the large constellation of narratives, drawings, writings, and other forms of architectural imagination that he will present tonight. We're very grateful for your visit, and without further ado, please give Jimenez a big round of applause.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is an incredible double homecoming for me. I lived in a former version of this school, and I'm just so happy to see that the school not only survives but thrives. Right? I can see from yesterday and today's interactions between the current students at the School of Architecture, the school formerly known as Taliesin. I can see that there are new bonds forming. In a weird way, I was so excited to see, let's say, a strange kind of Professor X hanging out with a strange kind of Professor Beast. and it's a school of gifted young individuals, finding their voices, and I find that to be so special, right? And hopefully that reference doesn't get past you, because I think to be abnormal, I think is the thing that so many of us strive towards, and I think by choosing to be here, you don't want to be normal, maybe. And I also want to say I wasn't expected to run into Shane Williamson, who was my professor, right? In fact, you'll see some of the things that, and I'll highlight things that Shane taught when this comes out. So today's talk, I'll structure it in such a way where I'll introduce myself a bit more, just talk about the things that I've done in a very abridged format. I'll introduce myself once more. I'll go into telling a few stories that has to do with my time here at Taliesin and how that transformed into something else. It'll have something to do with the Broadacre city. It'll have something to do with spaceships. I'll say something about, let's say, cloud watching, and later on, I'll say something about deep history, and finally, let's say the aesthetics of certain graphic qualities. I'll get into all of that. So, as Stephanie mentioned, over the past few years, I had the great fortune of doing a number of things I really enjoyed working on, including representing Taiwan at the Venice Biennale, or let's say, designing things that got collected by museums that I really love, including LACMA. I designed this lamp called Scribble. And you also see later on, I'll show some things that are not necessarily architecture, they're more at the furniture scale, right? This is how Stephanie and I met when we worked on the MoMA PS1 proposal in the same year. And over the years, some things didn't get built. I mean, the MoMA PS1 proposal, which I won't talk about today, was an aggregation of pools. We were just thinking about finding pools and hanging them. If you're interested in learning a bit more about this project, we made a YouTube video that says a lot about pools. So much so that we even started designing houses using pools, right? So this was a house. We had a client for this project, but went so over budget that we couldn't do it. But the same client was originally, was for a time they're interested in exploring other things that are smaller scoops rather than bigger pools, if that makes sense. Alongside these kinds of, let's say, architectural proposals that are either built or unbuilt, I had also done quite a lot of drawings, oftentimes by hand. This was a series of, so the total collection of these drawings were 24 feet by 24 feet by 4 feet, entirely drawn by hand. And this was collected by the Art Institute of Chicago. And, is the work cartoonish? Yes, and I'll say much more about that. Is the architecture buildable? I'm also going to say yes. we've been really thinking about, let's say, the plausibility, at the very minimum, the structural plausibility of these things, and sometimes the bureaucratic plausibilities of these things. And alongside all of that, you know, I've been heavily involved in publications, right? Like they're not just the book that Stephanie mentioned, but also organizing exhibitions for other people, publishing other people's work. This was a series called Treatise, where 14 publications were made back a few years ago. But Citizens of No Place was this first book that was published some years ago, and it really is a comic book. And Shane was there, actually. Shane saw the first version of this when I was in first year grad school at University of Toronto, where out of panic at a final review, not knowing what to pin up, I drew comics, which oddly enough went over very well. To a point where I just kept doing it for many, many years. And there are, at this point, I guess in the body of work of Bureau Spectacular, I think it can be largely defined by two streams of work. One is cartoons about architecture, in which case the medium is cartoon, right? The comic books, cartoons, that's the medium. And architecture architecture is the subject matter, right? Architecture will be the subject matter of a medium that is not architecture. The second stream is cartoonish architecture, where the medium is architecture, right? Architectural drawings, front axons, plans, elevations. But cartoon becomes a sensibility, not the medium. The medium is architecture. So both, I would say both streams have existed, cartoons about architecture and cartoonish architecture. And the odd thing about doing cartoons about architecture is that, you know, over time, we've been recognized for doing these things to a point where we get hired we got hired to make this urban analysis for a real estate group in downtown Los Angeles, to basically make cartoons about the city. And that they wanted this, right? We told them, I don't know how this is gonna help you, but no, we want you to look at our city a little differently. We want your abnormal point of view. We want you to be abnormal. Like, we've had enough people who have been able to make super rational analyses of our city. Please help us see the city a little differently. And this was around the time of, 2020, 2021, both years were very tumultuous, to say the least, for many reasons that we all have experienced collectively, including the murder of George Floyd. And lest we forget, at the time when we were doing this analysis, we were working to help our clients recognize that it wasn't the civic infrastructure that was used in a time of political turmoil. It was the vehicular infrastructure. People took it to the streets. The vehicular infrastructure doubled as a civic infrastructure, right? We were graphically representing this, especially kind of talking about the Pershing Square being virtually unused, right? At the time when it's most needed, it's not used. And the statement could be only made. The statement could be only made if the people marched, right? Or, you know, around, let's say, more cartoons about architecture, for the same analysis that we made around this time, there was a rapid dip in, occupancy. So let's say major offices where, like, office buildings dipped below 80% occupancy, sometimes dipped all the way down to 50% occupancy. We were, let's say, evacuating the volumes that would eventually make up the 40%, 50%, and starting to see the city a little differently. We're talking about the city programmatically a little differently. It's weird that they bought this, right? I'm still sometimes not sure how, but they did, which is fine. But graphically, though, as we do this, you know, there are times that I look back at the let's say aesthetic choices, whether it's color, surface conditions, material conditions that reflect where it becomes matte. You know, how do we deal with a new kind of gradient that seems very late 20-teens or early 2020s? And what does that gradient say about certain sensibilities of this time, right? And so when we draw cartoons about architecture, and when we build things that are cartoonish architecture, you know, are there, let's say, spirits of the times that we can capture using these kinds of colors, right? colors and materiality. More on the this kind of urban analysis. You know, like I think citizens of no place is this. You know, I sometimes think back to the title of that book. You know, and reflecting on whether or not there is a political element in the work of Bureau Spectacular. And I think, you know, by engaging with this real estate group who wanted to understand the city a little differently, we wanted to tell them about the social uprisings, the pandemic, as well as the wealth gap that downtown LA, Los Angeles is one of the, I guess, most severe, let's say extreme, I guess, highs and lows in terms of the wealth gap. The people who can afford things are so wealthy, and at the same time, there are so many people living on streets, right? And so, without really designing anything, what we did here was simply, you know, turn off the layer in Rhino in, I guess, all the parts that are, like, I guess, revealing only the parts that are inaccessible to the ground, as though there's a fleet of antisocial spaceships hovering over the city in the form of, you know, rooftop penthouses or, let's say, nice bars and so forth. You know, if you were to think about a diagram of a cul-de-sac, maybe the value of a cul-de-sac, it's in its inaccessibility. And in that inaccessibility, we're really talking about a kind of exclusivity, right? And now, if you rotate it 90 degrees, the 90-degree rotation of that cul-de-sac produces the same diagram in all over most major cities, especially in downtown Los Angeles. So this was a, in a way, we wanted to subtly say this to our clients, which they subtly listened. But going back to the aesthetics of the gradient and these kinds of colors, right? Over the past, I mean, for some of you who spend a lot of time on YouTube while you study or work, you might have come across a channel called Chilled Cow, or the, what do you call that? The lo-fi girl, lo-fi girl, right? There's a very specific graphic quality to what later became, what is no longer, what do you call that? Vaporwave. What is no longer vaporwave. I mean, where it started was vaporwave, but then by the time it got to lo-fi hip hop, like chill hop, right? There's a very consistent graphic sensibility that we wanted to kind of think about I guess the aesthetics of chill. Like, what does it mean to have what does that mean right now? And so sometimes when we build, this is a structure we built in front of the City Hall in Los Angeles last year. We wanted to find a way to channel that, right? Like, I think this is a light well or light scoop inside of the structure titled House of Words, where we collaborated with a musician. So this thing operates a lot like a guitar. So the musician eventually plugged his, you know, instruments into the body, the cavity of the structure, and we just played these sounds in front of the City Hall. Almost as though I mean, the reference here was that movie In the Mood for Love, where in the ending sequence, the protagonist whispers into the structure, whispers into the architecture, as to kind of let go of some of the sorrows. And so here, you can see that there's, actually you can't really see it, but the instrument that we eventually were able to, and the amplifiers we were able to eventually implement into the structure, allow for visitors to say something into the House of Words in front of the City Hall. Going back to cartoons about architecture and maybe this fixation with spaceships, these are some of the drawings I was making at the time when I kept making spaceship stories. And I really hope there comes a day I get to talk about this with Lydia Kalipuliki. You know, if I think her and I may have shared some type of suspicion of sustainability, if that makes sense. But it all comes back to my time at Taliesin West. Okay, so this was there was a collaborative, I guess, relationship between the University of Toronto and Taliesin West through the Howarth Wright Fellowship, I got to come to the United States and study Frank Lloyd Wright. And I got to meet Frank Henry, who's no longer with us, but he was the studio master at Taliesin West, right? And the thing that really caught my attention while I was here was this ginormous model of the Broadacre City. The Broadacre City, I think, at the time when Frank Lloyd Wright proposed it, he was wary of the congestions of high-density cities such as, Manhattan or Chicago, right? To a point where he looked at the Jeffersonian grid and wanted every household to have their own acre and be self-sustaining in how they grow their own food, right? And the result of that, as I did, especially after driving through the United States for the first time, was an endless field of suburban houses, I would say. That's really the physical realization and manifestation of the Broadacre City, which I felt to be so unsustainable. Like at the time I was thinking, well, the best thing we can do is package the Broadacre City and shoot it into space where it cannot expand. So as a rhetorical project, I kind of, was developing this idea that if the Broadacre City were a spaceship, what happens, if people are living in it, what happens to the people who have to float around and, find a way to generate energy, find a way to kind of talk to each other, connect with each other in vacuum. How do they document their memories as being humans on Earth? And what do they do when you construct things without gravity? And especially without gravity, what happens to plans, elevations, reflected ceiling plans if they all become plans, right? It got to a point where I mean, even though I didn't get to build a shelter, I was allowed to build a structure on the loading dock. This was one of those plan equals elevation equals reflected ceiling plan conditions, one of the modules that would exist inside of this Broadacre City spaceship, right? Luckily, I entered a competition shortly after my time at Taliesin, and I was able to build it, right? So this was at a gallery in Los Angeles at a place called Materials and Applications, and it's former space, and the call for entry was at the time was called anti-gravity defiance. I think they were looking for things that float, right? But instead, I was proposing the most dominating thing in design and in architecture is the designation of drawings in otherwise completely orthographic views, right? Plan, elevation, reflected. These are all equally orthographic projections. Now, if you were to rotate the room at once an hour, what then happens is every 15 minutes, one of the surfaces would become plan. And every 7.5 minutes, everyone gets to fully experience life on the oblique. The way in which Claude Parent and Paul Virilio might have prescribed. And this idea of life without gravity, floating around in space inside of the Broadacre City, just kept going. I kept thinking, in addition to orthographic projections as being, gravity-based designations, our relationship with the ground also generate different, let's say, readings of massing and the function of massing in either elevation or plan, right? Because in elevation, due to our relationship with the ground, maybe the shape of the massing could begin to imply, let's say, persona of that mass, which I'll get into a bit more. Conversely, the plan, it's less of a visual device, but more of an organizational device. And so, the plan, the conditions of the plan are so different from, here's an interesting plan, which then becomes a boring massing, or an interesting section that becomes a pretty bad plan. And so these were some of the things I kept thinking about from points of view. And obviously this totally relates to, if you're reading massing and reading characters out of massing, it totally relates to not just Venturi and Dean Scott Brown, but the other mothership, which, you know, I guess so many of Nima Bednes and Stephanie, where they all met at the other mothership being Cooper Union, John Hiddock's work had began to kind of dig a deeper and deeper impact on me. Yesterday we were talking about how Scott Cohen showed up and made a dent. I think Diane Lewis made a dent on me. You know, she taught me John Hiddock. So, but in terms of, you know, reading things in plan versus in elevation, and let's say performing the act of cloud watching, around this time I got really sucked into this concept called pareidolia, where you kind of look for faces. We all look for faces, right? You know, like it's innate in all of us. I mean, more and more we're learning about the distinction between Homo neanderthals and Homo sapiens. It's less so. I mean, I'll go back to this for photo opportunity. I mean, in fact, there's an even better photo opportunity here, which okay, I'll do it later. One of the key distinctions between Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals, it's not so much one is smarter, or we're probably about as smart as each other. The key distinction is our social abilities, right? Homo sapiens are so good at being social. In fact, we're so good at being social that we can read somebody's face and determine in a split second if that's a friend or a foe. Okay, we can do this. Neanderthals, less so. It's now, we're now able to learn more and more about their pack structure. It's roughly 7 to 10 people, Neanderthals, at a time, whereas we are able to form deep bonds with something like 120 people easily, right? And it's really this innate ability to know who we can and cannot cooperate with that allowed us to be so successful. And this ability is so hardwired into our system that we look for faces on rocks and trees and buildings. And not, these are just piles of rocks that we somehow are able to assign gender and personality to a pile of rocks. And I think the nuances of, let's say, parts of a face that generate an idea about someone in elevation, right? At times, when I think about the compositional suggestion, whether or not it's very explicit or less explicit, you know, it's an exercise in cloud watching, right? It's an exercise in cloud watching. So coming back to architecture, though, how does this help us, you know, if we want to think about architecture? The tripartite stack, as described early on by Louis Sullivan in Chicago, got taken so hyperbolically by Adolf Loos, where in the Tribune Tower competition proposal, there's literally a base shaft capital, like the tripartite stack, right? The base shaft capital, all of which etymologically relates to the human anatomy, right? And so for thousands of years now, we've, let's say, studied the human form or the human body or the body language or the implicit communication of the body, where we are able to read a, let's say, stiff personality, a relaxed personality, or an intense personality, strictly based on how they, let's say, posture their bodies, right? And could it be that sometimes when I think about the massing of the Seattle Public Library, it's a tripartite stack performing contrapposto, right? Maybe that's why it's a relaxed building. Thinking about this so much so that I started drawing a cartoon about architecture in this case, involving a person in the jungle, you know, who's stalking a deer. He jumps and slays the deer, but he does not take the flesh. Instead, he takes the skin of the deer. He takes the skin of the deer, peels it enthusiastically, sews it back together, and covers himself under this cloak. Under this cloak, he dances for someone that he's attracted to. And as he covers the details of his body under this cloak, he conceals and abstracts the body language. And suddenly, the true intentions of how he dances becomes more like a skyline and less as a series of exact communication. They become inexact communication. And so this idea of, let's say, the massing in elevation that reads like implied personality, to me, you know, like, it got to a point where I at the time, I was also like, in order to study this idea, I was doing it myself. So, you know, I was kind of dancing and learning it, because I came to the realization that you don't really need to read the face to understand the persona. Just to really drive this point further, right? Sometimes it's not so much what you're saying, but it's how you're saying it, right? A building is a building where I'm a human, but I'm how human this way, and therefore convey something very implicit. And just the same way that nothing, I mean, the only defining distinction between every single one of these sentences is how they're said, making what irrelevant. It's how that becomes meaningful. Just the same way that I think of the skyline as the sentences that are the what, being equalizing, you know, turning all of them into, let's say, content-wise, one-to-one, but it's how each city is said. And turning it back to architects, it's how the individual architects design the individual architecture that helps spell out the voice of that city, if that makes sense. I mean, this is a very simple concept because, you know, all of us are familiar with the idea that someone would print a skyline on a t-shirt or a mug. It becomes a source of identity for people who, you know, believe in their city, right? And coming back to this idea of the cloud watching with the elevation versus plan, after coming back from the spaceship, you know, I went on for the past, I want to say 8 to 10 years, I went on this journey of figuring out how to cut shape to imply persona as opposed to prescribe persona, if that makes sense. And I think, you know, time and again, I refer to the Krupp Union as a mothership for that reason, right? Like when I think about the work of John Haydock, he was the expert of suggesting persona and never making a duck. And so this is one of the early installations we did at Bureau Spectacular. Luckily, this is collected by MoMA. And it's a structure that tumbles, but each time it tumbles, a kind of new proportion emerges, right? And so it gave us a chance to think about geometry, let's say management of proportions of geometry, and so forth. And more recently, we had a chance to build another persona, let's say, at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So this was at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. This project is titled "A Flock Without a Murder." This is the call for entry was a birdhouse, and you know, a flock of birds without a murder of crow. And so we were thinking, how do we build a structure that looks like a scarecrow, but not exactly a scarecrow for the humans that read it, and you know, and what is this kind of, let's say, extra human, extra species communication? Like, can architecture, if in Denny Scott Brown and Robert Venturi's way of thinking about Las Vegas, where architecture becomes the semiotic device, it's not so much the language of the architecture is communicating, it is that the architecture is communicating on the behalf of people without the language, right? Architecture is the language in that case. And so I was really thinking, taking that a little bit further, if we were to, because we have been talking to crows through built things, and how else do we build it in such a way that only the crows that are smart enough can see it, and the other birds that can't see it might even use it as a birdhouse. And so, I mean, more recently though, we kind of like are just starting to go a little overboard with these kinds of characters. I don't know, the same real estate group from downtown Los Angeles, after doing that whole analysis, they liked us enough that they asked us to do a VR kind of built environment over Grand Avenue in downtown LA. And I think, you know, it's worth also saying something about the Coachella project we did a few years ago as being a part of this series of studies about persona or personality, right? Again, going back to sculptures and contrapposto, Roman sculptures are a little different from Greek ones because I guess bronze sculptures are effectively, let's say, sheet metal, where if you were to cantilever really far, or if you were to, let's say, let the load-bearing member be on one leg and the other one is more of a kickstand, bronze can do that much better than marble. The moment you do marble, the Romans, I mean, once I say this, you can never unsee it. It's everywhere, okay? Romans need a third leg for, like, none of their sculptures are bipedal. Here, they snuck in a baby as the third leg for a tripod. And you'll, like I said, you'll never be able to unsee this. Sometimes it's the form of tree log, sometimes it's a shirt, you know, it's or a sword. It's these kinds of tripods. I mean, these are Roman sculptures are always making tripods. And you know, as somebody who's always interested in cartoons and anime, like some of you might recognize the Ginyu Force from Dragon Ball Z. You know, these are some of my favorite characters from Dragon Ball Z because of how dynamic they are in their dances. And we were just thinking, can we think of this as the expression of persona as a structural problem, right? If one of my legs is if I'm being lazy or sassy and going like this, this is a severe structural issue, right? Like I think I'm kind of letting, but if we were to think of less so each character as being bipedal, but a bunch of, let's say, tripods and none of the legs are let's say, upright, can we let them slouch and lean onto each other? And how do we build it in such a way where, I guess, you know, we were developing this idea where, you know, let's make something like a pelvic bone with a bunch of, let's say, lopsided legs, and stack a bunch of bubbles and backpacks so that this thing slouches and humps over. And so this project was titled Tower of 12 Stories. You know, it lights up, which was really fun. Coachella, by the way, I had more like not party type me, so it was really fun to go finally. But they had amazing infrastructure. If you've ever been to Coachella, so we were very lucky to work with some of the best people in lighting to turn this around. But the Tower of 12 Stories, you know, like going back to cartoons about architecture. Earlier on, I had been thinking about let's say, the idea of typical plans. If you were to resist the typical plan and stuff a bunch of bubbles within the typical plan, you know, are there ways in which we disrupt that and turn towers into more personalities? We tackled something similar, again, going back to the Venice Biennale project when we represented Taiwan. Can we make a bunch of characters? Can we deconstruct the domestic setting and turn each domestic program into a character? Like the bathroom's a character, the kitchen's a character, the bedroom's a character. And once you scatter them and redistribute them, you know, can some of the characters say something else about, you know, their relationship with each other? And could this become then a way of producing an interior urbanism, right? Like if every domesticity is deconstructed, let's say gaps and streets, and you know, rooms are more of a city condition. We had a chance to study this again recently in Milan, in this project called Immobile, inside of one of the Milanese tunnels in the Drop City project. But you know, all these, let's say, childish, cartoonish, you know, qualities, you know, has inspired, let's say, both colleagues and critics to use a word which I deeply detest to label my work, which is playful. I freaking detest that word, playful, because you know, like it sounds like I'm not thinking about it and it's dumb. And as you just heard, I really think about it, right? But perhaps it's, you know, like, but just keep telling these stories. And I'll maybe come back to this label later on. Here's a story about 3 kids graduating kindergarten. You know, the typical things they talk about what they want to do when they grow up, firefighter, astronaut type things, or professional athletes. And they also talk about the types of houses they will live in. And you know, eventually they get into fights about the kinds of whose house is better, whose house is bigger. Instead of fighting, they decide that, you know, maybe as they imagine their futures, they'll put all of their proposals together as one building, right? So they're collaging all of their future suggestions into this superstructure. But this idea of like adding buildings to buildings, or collaging buildings onto buildings or into buildings, is something that we have been also developing over the past few years. And so this was an exhibition we did at SFMOMA, where we started kind of taking this a little bit further. How do you produce diagrams where, and how do you add, right? Add is such an arbitrary word. Is skewer a type of adding? Is bundling a type of adding? Is stacking and twisting and stacking a type of, adding? And more than that, though, is the act of compositionally adding the only adding we do? Because I don't think so, since we also always add, let's say, cultural references and influences. There was a time when we were never really, let's say, comfortable with the conflation of pop art and high art, so to speak, until we kind of, let's say, at a certain point, kind of gave up and just embraced both, right? Just embraced high art and pop art combined together. So it's not compositionally only, it's also culturally adding. All right. I'm going to continue, just power through a bit more. So back to the spaceship. Because of Taliesin, I thought about spaceships so much. Remember we were on this Broadacre City spaceship. So this person comes home from that spaceship, okay? He returns to Earth. And he's greeted by this creature who says, "Welcome back to Earth," and much to his chagrin, because of space warp, he had been gone for 10,000 years, right? So he returned to Earth. It's been 10,000 years, and this creature is so excited. He says, "Oh, your culture no longer exists. Oh, I'm so excited to meet you because I'm an anthropologist, and my thesis project is the average taste of the early 21st century." Could you tell me, I have so many questions for you, could you tell me, was architecture this or that? Because according to all of the academic records in the early 21st century, architecture appears to be this, but in every archaeological dig, architecture, the records mismatch the finds, the evidence mismatch the academic records. So seriously, nowhere, could you, so to conclude my first question, could you tell me what may have caused the divergence? And he says, "Oh shoot, everyone's dead. Because I don't have to pay my taxes anymore. Should have redeemed my Costco points, stuff like that, right?" But in 2019, we were asked by the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, South Korea, to construct a project that they titled this project Unearthing the Future, right? And this was to celebrate the 100th year anniversary of the death of the last king of Korea, who had a vision of, let's say, a cosmopolitan Korea that attracts foreign artists to, let's say, make art and produce culture in Korea, right? And so we had a chance to construct this thing right on the site of his palace, this installation, which is titled The Future Archaeologist. Because every time we perform an archaeological dig, we dig into Earth, as though our relationship with the ground is a relationship with history. Meaning 2,000 years later, 2,000 years ago, the Roman Forum was there, and that's 2,000 years or 6 meters later, right? So 6 meters in the future, we might be able to attain a new datum where we can look at a future archaeological dig where we, at a glance, reveal the society as it were in 2019, kind of 2,000 years in the past and 2,000 years in the future. And so this was a really kind of, I don't know, like Taliesin had that kind of impact on me, right? Like it wasn't just enough to shoot the Broadacre City into space. It kind of had an impact on almost every aspect of my future projects. I think I'm just gonna start to skip things. Like this here, I would have been talking about fiction, the idea of fiction writing, and a story about a murder, three witnesses to a murder, all suspects, a butler, the wife, a classmate. The butler, I guess, got fed up and struck the billionaire with a statue in the head, and the house caught on fire, burned down, and he tried to save the victim, but it didn't work. And so he says, "Lock me up. My dead employer deserved justice. I murdered him." Right? And the wife tells a story about jealousy of the husband. Right? He had just been spying on him. The house was designed in such a way where there's no corner for her to hide. He's just so jealous, and she was so fed up, and I guess she also hit him in the head with the statue, and the house also caught on fire. And she says, well, nothing escapes him but at his last gaze, because she couldn't figure out whether or not he was looking at her in his last gaze or himself, right? The statues of him. Or the classmate who was talking about, fairness and sharing, kind of like thing that they made in the past, but he also, I guess, obviously this is heavily referencing the movie Rashomon, if you haven't seen the movie Rashomon, but also, thinking about the types of trauma that each murderer, alleged murderer, had a relationship with the victim. Each murder was a diagram of a different house. They each described a different house. But in making the story, eventually got to a point where it was less about the story or less about the fiction, but more about the graphic qualities of the fiction. It got to a point where we were reconstructing some of the spaces within the story, and they even turned into real furniture that we exhibited. So this was at the Volume Gallery in Chicago a few years ago. We got to, so here's a coat hanger saint, if that makes sense. Where shadows of things that have been burned down, or things they wish they had, or carpets that are parts of that world. I mean, other furniture projects that we eventually worked on, took on more, let's say, graphic qualities than both graphic qualities, but also social qualities. This was something that we did early on at the storefront for art and architecture. I was showing Nick earlier how to cut foam. So if you guys want to figure out how to cut foam, you can do a lot with foam cutters. Okay, so all this is from a small foam cutter eventually to furniture, right? Taliesin has such an impact on me. I think earlier with Daniel we were talking about the word commune, right? Communal, and. In my undergrad, which was also at U of Toronto, I studied a variety of things, including some sociology classes, and I was introduced to the Phalanx theory by Charles Fourier, right? Charles Fourier proposes a building inside of a city, and there was a very specific number. And so in years after, I did write a story about a building inside of a city, except this one starts with a person who's leaving the house, leaving the house, getting on the elevator with a scientist person. They're talking about stuff on the elevator ride. In fact, they were talking about tall buildings. And the scientist says, hey, do you remember back in 2009 when they finished the Burj Khalifa? That was the tallest building in the world. People were asking, how high can we go? What would it look like? And where would it be? And so in this world, the answer of how high can we go stops at when we run out of oxygen, which is about 12 kilometers, right? So that's 12 kilometers in the sky, and you can faintly make out the skyline of Manhattan, because this is the extrusion of Central Park for 12 kilometers, having the capacity for 87 million people, which is the size of Germany, okay? It's no longer a city inside of a building. It's a political and economic entity inside of a building. Where the figure ground of Manhattan turns into reverse. It's a reversed figure ground of Manhattan. And zoning has to be thought through in section instead of plan, as well as housing typologies in section instead of plan to engage with cloud conditions. And so they get to the top. I guess the answer was, as you know, it is physically impossible to live up here. Your job is to stay here for 1 year. If you survive, we're going to keep building. he does survive. I don't know. I'm kind of like running a little late, so I'm just gonna.
Please.
Okay. I mean, he does survive. He comes back to talk to his spouse, where, he's just kind of gone mad somehow, right? Like, he wrote all these letters to his spouse about how he's wasting time, and she said, what's gotten into you? Your letters are really worrisome, and that's what's gotten into him. He says, well, in my year of solitude, I've come to realize something really important. I want to be exceptional at what I love. And so he's got strategies in the head and geometries in the heart. And so he described this idea that he needed to accelerate the process of becoming good at what he loves. Meaning he has to spend day and night inside of a box working on things that he wants to do. At the time I was kind of reflecting on, let's say, personal choices. I did build a box in order to accelerate things I want to do well. So this was the briefcase house that was constructed around 2009. That was my cat. I lived inside of this thing, and that was the beginning of Bureau Spectacular. I was working outside of that box and waking up and just going to work. I guess because this was a warehouse space, I was living at work as opposed to working from home. But when this thing was completed, I was asking myself the question: did I just do architecture? Like, is this architecture? And the answer I had was no. This was too small to be architecture, but too big to be furniture, a super furniture. This was the beginning of the typology of scale within my office that we kept on doing, including a retail store where we designed a super furniture for the retail store, which, I guess it's a staircase that deconstructs into all the retail components, like, I guess, racks and fitting rooms. Or this other super furniture, an indoor treehouse for a tech company. But more recently, the work from home, live at work thing, in thinking about the possibilities of a comic book being deconstructed into programmatic parts, we started kind of like working on actual ground-up residential commissions. So this is a house where I guess the slices of life in the comic book form becomes interior elevations, and these kinds of, let's say, piecemealing of the interior elevations now has turned into a plan that's approved by the city, and it's under construction right now. So that's a sad relief on my end. So what am I doing now these days after all these years? I'm building some buildings. There's this one. There's another project in the Phoenix area. I'll be back quite a bit. Hopefully, I'll be doing more stuff with you guys as I'm back in Phoenix. But I'm also writing books. I'm writing a book with this Dutch philosopher guy named Timotheus Vermeulen, about the status of Zoom, working from home, living at work. What are some of the, let's say, unforeseen conditions that we're learning? But I mean, LA is so strict with their zoning, you can never do commercial things in residential spaces. Yet the moment that the pin dropped, everyone was working from home, right? So this kind of like conflation of zoning, we thought to be super interesting. And him as a media-based philosopher, and me as a person who deals with the built environment, this was a really great Google Doc that we started just sharing and writing. And so right now we're writing this book called The Post-Zoom Society, which is exciting. And I think some of the post-Zoom Society thoughts even translated into workshops that I've run. So this was a workshop that I did at UCLA, thinking about what people are doing in their Zoom world. And the etiquette of it, yeah, I think, so Timotheus and I both really hate it when people turn off their cameras. So we're just describing kind of like, people, anyway. And how Tim and I write together is also through this mutual fascination with pop culture, right? So he wrote this whole thing called metamodernism, but that's him, that's not me. That's how I first learned about him. And so that's, another exciting thing that I'm working on. I'm gonna end by telling one last story, one last story. And this last story is about this building, a real building in downtown Los Angeles called One Wilshire, right? So if you visit downtown LA, you'll happen upon One Wilshire, which is Grand and 6th, something like that. One Wilshire looks like an office building, but it's not an office building anymore, right? Once upon a time, it was an office building designed by SOM, but around the turn of the 21st century, it became basically a giant server. It is the connective point under which the cross-Pacific cables reaches Tokyo, right? So it's basically a robot that continues to look like serving humans. Okay, so One Wilshire is inside of the skyline of downtown LA, which is inside of this window. And this window is inside of this room, which is inside of a model. This model is inside of a photo shoot, which is inside of somebody's computer, which is inside of someone's office. And this office is actually a file inside of a network of files inside of a server, which is inside of a network of servers inside of One Wilshire. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So, first of all, that was amazing. Thank you. Really feeling inspired, and I'm curious how you, because a lot of this, I'm feeling like there's inherently a story, right? Like where you find a story within these projects. What's your process for finding the story? I was thinking, you work through the sketches, and that kind of becomes maybe your own process of finding a narrative, or is it writing for, like, kind of, if you can describe that process?
I mean, I want to say it's not so dissimilar from Ja in that it's observations, right? I feel like what I like about the best stories I like are derived from reality, right? Like they're so plausible. They might be stranger than fiction. So I think most of the stories are elements of the context, if that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, there's another story that's an actual short story in text form that I published a couple of years ago. It's again about a spaceship, but it was really about the pandemic, right? So I wrote a story based on pandemic realities. Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of blurring of material and materiality.
Uh,
But what would you say on average your first observation is? Do you think it's a material object, or do you think it's some sort of immaterial condition?
I want to say more oftentimes immaterial than material. More often, sometimes material, but more oftentimes immaterial. And I want to also attribute this to maybe undergrad. The kind of like variety of classes I took in undergrad helped. So I had a Bachelor of Arts. I did take some architecture classes, but it really helped with critical thinking. So I want to say that, like, and critical thinking oftentimes is maybe the thing about something that's not exactly that thing, if that makes sense, right? So, which means immaterial most of the time.
The question was whether the first observation is material or immaterial.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
But I see material.
Yeah, most of the time immaterial, I would say. Yeah. Like, for example, like if I think about the movie Top Gun, right? Like, I don't think it's a movie about airplanes or the U.S. military. It's about repressed homosexuality, right?
Yeah.
And so, well, it's not very repressed. It's actually very obvious when you think about it. And so, and I would say that type of observation would be more likely immaterial.
Yeah, I just ask because in my own work I spend a lot of time looking at material objects, waiting for that next step to happen. Sometimes it never does. So it's worth looking.
Right.
On that note, do you think you could speak a little bit to the relationship between humor and craft,
Right.
both of which are
Yeah,
embedded in your work.
and maybe this goes back to my, let's say, allergic reaction to the word playful, right?
Right.
Because it takes a lot of craft to write something funny,
Right.
and you don't even know if it's funny, right? Like where when one writes it, it could be bad. And
Yeah.
so I guess that there's maybe like the frustration with that word playful, and so I mean, I care about craft so much. I think maybe there's almost nothing more important than craft, right? Maybe going back to, it's not what you're saying, but how you're saying it. How is craft? And craft may not necessarily only be in the form of tectonics or stereotonics. It could be in the form of how the thing is positioned and written. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-up to that one. So I was really, I was on my phone, and after you said that you had a stern reaction to the playfulness, I had to like Google the semantics behind playfulness, right? So the playfulness went word to play to another word of fun, right?
Yeah.
And then at what point do you take yourself so seriously to not think that playfulness should not be taken seriously as well?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm thinking too, is where playfulness in its own definition is a compounding, right? And you just even just like it's a very German thought, but it's a compounding of innocent collection of experiences. And if we think about play is just the act of fun. So then if we're to think about that, why can't we be playful about being serious about what we do?
Yeah, no, the way you frame playful is so much nicer than the way that playful has
It's just
been.
like when I think about it, I don't want to do architecture, and I'm an architect. I want to be playful every day.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the word playful has been used on me not that way. It's like, oh, this guy's kind of dumb. But I like the way you framed it.
In French, there are two words. Ludic, which is an English word that no one ever uses, and the word jeu, which is related to jouissance, which is this moment of awakening, but is also tied to an orgasm. That's interesting because sometimes you can deploy them in different ways, as a compliment or a slight in that.
Yeah. Could be. I like fun things. I don't dismiss fun things. I think going back to the.
But there's also another word I overlooked was innocence, right? The innocent act of experience. Too.
Yeah.
So like the fact that there isn't like a malevolent cause or a directed agenda behind the fun that you're having.
Mm-hmm.
It just it's a playfulness, right? It's the compounding of words that also interests me. But another discussion.
Yeah.
I see there's something a little different than, playfulness is, it sounds juvenile, right? But your work is more kind of ironic in a way, which is much more thoughtful. There's an irony in there. Would you agree with that? Does that make you feel okay?
No, I've also thought about irony so much,
Right.
and it's why I was drawn to Timotheus's work in the first place. He was unpacking. Well, I guess architecture is always slightly late to the game. By 2006, there was a, let's say, resurgence in postmodernism in art, literature, and cinema. And I guess it was only in the 20-teens that architecture started to do that, right? Do some type of resurgence of postmodernism. But in his point of view, it's not a resurgence of postmodernism. And he works very hard to define the qualities of postmodernism and the function of irony in postmodernism. And he suggests that there's an oscillation between irony and sincerity in the contemporary voice, not strictly irony in the sense of irony as a rhetorical device. Irony as a rhetorical device, in Vermeulen's argument, was necessary to, let's say, subvert the grand narrative and singular, what do you call that? How's it written? The grand narrative of modernism, right? It was there. It was super important for, irony to subvert the singular narrative of modernism. But he doesn't think that. So I thought a lot about irony as well. I think I have it, but then why I found his work sympathetic is because I feel a kind of constant oscillation and a conflation of both irony and sincerity. At least in my generation, I think not just me, like a lot of people in my generation have that voice.
It was really amazing. Something that, your, obviously your friends and also people that you look at them more carefully, but it takes a while and then you realize, sometimes, the long path has passed. It's amazing to see, because we always knew you as a person, during that period that you were going to Taliesin and then you went to Atelier Van Lieshout. So
by the way, Shane introduced Atelier Van Lieshout for me.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about it. It's not a coincidence that he's here.
Yeah.
But there are a few things in your work that I thought, now that I see all of it, the most fantastic, there was a question last night, how do you, when was the critical moment in our career, or how does it happen? And I think Scott Constant was brought up, and I think there is something fascinating about the part that you have so many influences that you always went through and you always gathered. It's something. The fact that you kind of digested all of them and as part of it, internalized it and we don't even recognize. But the part that is amazing to see after these years, I think that's partly because you teach, is the precision that now you, in reflecting back these things, everything that you explained was so precise and also so referential to the history of architecture, which was fantastic. That was really good. And then, on the note of precision, yesterday when we were in character,
Right. Yeah.
when we were in Cosanti, I was amazed by the character, but I was very disturbed by lack of precision of geometry of pieces that were not perfectly sitting.
Yeah.
And actually your work and even your drawings are very precise. Even your, the cartoons that are hand-drawn are extremely influenced by your experience in 3D software. So everything that you draw, and I know you were saying that Paulo Saleri's drawings were great, and I agree with you, but today we didn't buy them because I got disturbed by the lack of precision of geometry in those sketches. They were three-dimensional thoughts and desires that were not precise. And not that it's a bad thing, you can build it, the beauty of it is you can build it imprecisely, and that's a question. But your drawings are always very precise. Even the cow, the deer height that you draw, it seems that you've on road surfaces before.
No, that's rhino. Yeah.
That's rhino. So
In
your
thought.
rhino is
Rhino in
embedded
thought,
in
yeah.
your system, right?
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. And I think the precision of how you can draw something that comes from the fact that you've been modeling that a lot in there, and I think that's really remarkable. And on that note of precision, I think this is the real question that we have, and I think your point, the moment you talked about structure, the Roman structure, the thing that we're not going to, and you're right, I'm not going to be not noticing that again, is the fact that there is something, the beauty of, for example, just one project is the fact that you question gravity and through rotation. But there is something, exactly, this moment, this is the thing that we have in our office as a project for us. I don't think it's something that is very interesting, may ruin your work.
Oh, this may ruin my work.
No, the thing that I'm going to mention, which is about the ruthlessness of structure, structural behavior. And when characters and figures, the idea of, I'm not sure if these, this project, which is fantastic about leaning, things that are leaning, and surfaces that are structural as, surface. So, are you interested in precision of structural behavior of surfaces? Not always having structural frame versus, a surface that is creating the character.
that duality doesn't bother, because it bothers us and we are still building it this way.
Yeah.
And
The thing about that is kind of interesting, is that I think I know why you're showing this, in the sense of, you're right, like, I like that you're building a house, I do like it. But I also liked in your work that, like, this didn't matter. Like, you know, in a way, like, it's the final image, the white, like the perfect white and the simplicity, like that. Somehow, I've always been drawn to your work in that, the wonder of how that was made. Like, when I saw this project, of course, I hadn't seen all the steel and everything that was involved with it, and I was just like, you know, it's kind of extraordinary, because, like, I don't think that it was designed with, it's not structurally efficient.
No.
Right? Everything about it. And the wonder of that is really extraordinary in a way, like, that it's not modeled out of efficiency. And, like, the adjacency, you'll double surfaces, you celebrate gaps, and all of these things, which, I have to say, like, there are a lot that we resist those things. Like, the gap, the space in between, the vestigial space, all of that stuff. And I think that you start to conflate these things. Sometimes those gaps are programmed. Sometimes they're gaps between two programmed spaces. I think it's really extraordinary, this work. It's like, I mean, you know, like, for me, I think you're obliged to show that steel thing, because it shows, like, hey, this was a thing that we had to figure out. But there's something lovely about this. Like, I like that a lot of your work you don't unpack either. Like, it's one image and has a story. It's not like all of the diagrams that tell us about, you know, like, you described an instrument, but you didn't really tell us how the instrument worked. I kind of like that about your work. You know, that there's something projective in character. It's not meant to be unpacked. This isn't so much a point that I'm building off of,
it's a great point that what you reveal and what you don't.
Exactly.
But I'm saying the character of surfaces. Sometimes the character is the extreme profile, the silhouettes of things.
Yeah.
Sometimes the character is the in-between, the behavior of the surface in between. For example, the beauty of that, you know, when we see you within the carbide, is that there is something about the character of the surface that is part of it. And in a few of your pieces, exactly. So the behavior of the surface is part of the character. And the beauty of your work is sometimes you just flatten it and you ruthlessly just go to the profile. And I agree with that.
Yeah.
But as part of it, speaking of character, it seems that that's also something, if you can bring our attention to the difference between creases and things like that is not about the edge, but is about the between.
So and what I'm drawn to, like, in your your kind of, you know, this kind of idea of conflating orthographic drawings, plan, section, elevation. I have to say, like, you know, students don't really think about plan, elevations, and sections. They're all derived from a three-dimensional construct. It's like make 2D from Rhino.
Yes.
Is literally, that's something like the idea of drawing in plan or drawing in section is largely become a lost construct in academia, like, altogether. And so it's a real struggle today. Like, you know, to kind of, it's like even just that fascination of, like, one thing becoming another, like in the rotational construct. I think it's just super strong in your work, and I don't know, it's disappearing in a way, like in contemporary education.
I can't stop thinking in your work about the question of timing.
Timing.
Timing and Rhino being a time-based medium in that you can rotate and move around. It's basically kind of filmic image of an object rather than a kind of section which is timeless. And I've just been thinking about that, and I was thinking about it also in how you put together a comic.
Right.
And it's basically the premise of all comedy is timing.
It's time-based, for sure, yeah.
So I had to say that when that was on the screen because it's so tiny.
Yeah.
I also made me think about how architecture falls behind many mediums as well,
Yes.
I mean, or other professions
Yes.
in terms of its sectional
Yeah.
aspects, how so much information can be put into a section in an MRI,
Right.
or so many other things where we lose that kind of thinking as well.
But I think especially after talking with this Dutch guy, right? I find it okay that we're slower. I find that, you know, it's actually kind of normal that architecture is slower. than cinema, literature, or any other media or mediums. I mean, you know, first of all, it takes maybe like 5 years maybe for, like, if you're fast, maybe 3 years for, let's say, a substantial institutional building to be built, like City Hall or Concert Hall or something, that finally gets to reflect a conversation 5 years ago, you know. And so this does happen a lot. And so postmodernism was waning out by the time, let's say, the Portland building was finally constructed, right? Like in the 90s when things were like, late 80s, early 90s when things were like very popularly postmodern. In no other mediums, you know, was that still a thing. But I find it also oddly okay because in talking with this Dutch guy, he's saying, but then it's you guys who help us rethink the things that, you know, have already been said in built form. And, you know, it takes, like, let's say, human intelligence to properly process for a while longer. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I actually see it as part of our work to keep processing it.
I had a question that I want to ask you. So you were defined by your term playfulness, but you defined yourself today by a term called, it was a social media philosopher.
What? What?
And what did that term mean? I was really confounded by that term, the social media
Oh,
philosopher.
no, that was Timothy.
No, I'm not that person.
Oh. No, I just heard that term and I was just like, oh, I heard the
No, he's media philosophy, not social media, media philosophy.
So what did that exactly mean?
He teaches, so it's not me, he teaches media, and he talks about, let's say, he analyzes the movies, and he cross-examines, let's say, music to literature, and, you know, that's what he does. He also writes a lot of reviews on art. So media theory is what he does. I don't do that. I just like it.
And draw it.
Social media observer. Got that one wrong.
I was just thinking as a good closing question.
Hey.
I think Stephanie gets to
I don't think that's what the giggle was about.
No.
Oh,
No,
not a closing question.
I was like opening my mouth to say something.
Oh, I thought that he was playing at me, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Well, it was probably, the awkwardness of that moment was probably also part of the humor.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
Go for it.
It's a silly question, but I was just I'm just really trying to like have all the work sink in. But I was just wondering if there's any other building you would like to jettison into space.
Oh, you know, that's a great question. All right, I have an answer for that. And it's not an answer you would like. Because a friend of mine showed me this quote from Bob Venturi that says, you don't have to like something to learn from it. And that had such an impact on me that I guess in the language of your generation, I stopped being a hater.
Wow.
Yes. I try to look for lessons to learn from even the things I dislike the most.
Okay.
Yes.
So what would you send into space?
What?
So what would you send into space?
I'm not gonna. Yeah, nothing.
Oh, nothing.
Yeah, nothing. I just said
No,
nothing.
it doesn't. Okay.
No. I can't kind of. Oh, unless. Hang on a second. Unless, if we're talking about, because today we're just talking about Helmut Jan. If we shoot the if we shoot the Thompson Center into space, it would be kind of fun because every surface is occupiable. That would be kind of cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't interpret shooting something into space as
Oh, I see.
a bad.
Yeah.
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 It's a good.
Yeah. Great.
But,
Yeah.
but I thought he said that he hated that so much.
I
that
did
he thought
hate
he's
the
gonna
Broad Acre
shoot
City
it.
idea that I would shoot in space, but an older version of me would shoot the Thompson Center because it would be kind of fun to float around in it.
I see. I interpreted shooting it into space like as a celebration.
Ah.
Like how they shot like a Beatles album into
Oh.
space.
Or as a follow-up, what deserves to be shot through a time warp?
A what now?
Because you have the time warp, like your guy, he doesn't have to think
Oh,
of
time warp,
Oscar
time warp.
points anymore.
Well, but then that's everything we build, right? Everything we build is basically of the things that do survive will be, you know, archaeology.
I love that answer.
I had a question, but it wasn't as like climactic as this discussion.
Shooting space?
Can you shoot it?
Yeah, sure.
Shoot it?
Oh, okay, all right. Well, maybe it won't be a question, just an observation. I guess this goes back to my question about like the relationship between humor and craft and the kind of awkwardness that's embedded in your work, from the kind of misfit of the skin over the body to the typological awkwardness, like the scale between furniture and architecture. And I mean, I think those kind of in between states, that kind of awkward state is, I wonder if that's something you're interested in, or are you trying to, you know, is that the kind of in-between scale before you get to building buildings? Is that like, would you want to continue working on that?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think I'm in my mid-40s, but I feel more lost than ever, if that makes sense. And
sometimes it comes off as impoliteness, but
it does come off as
Well,
being,
it's
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it does come off as being, like, feeling lost sometimes comes off as being impolite, I know. But I think, you know, to your question, like, there are times that I'm super excited that I'm getting to build some buildings. It's taken so long to get here, which is kind of ridiculous. But then if I read enough biographies, it seems normal. That, you know, like 40-something, 50-something, that's when you build more. I don't know. I have no idea. Like, I was hanging out with Ante the other day, and he said, like, look at, we were walking around at a museum, and he was like, look at how easy that is. Just go make some art, man. But I think, you know, the idea of the scale, the media, or the mediums, do they conflict? Do they mismatch? I think the answer is always yes. And it's always really uncomfortable, and I don't really know what to do with it, besides just stay healthy and keep working. Yeah.
I asked this in the lecture yesterday as well, and I'm curious if you have any advice
Oh.
for our students, or if there's something you wish you were told earlier on in school or earlier on in your journey.
Well, I think, I don't know, I kind of, at a school like this, revisiting a school like this, and in front of a school that I went to, right, like U of Toronto, I feel like, you know, the question of fitting in has always been a difficult thing in our lives, right? Like, I think, how do I fit in as an architect? Do I go get a license? You know, do I go work at KPMB and, you know, feel satisfied or something? I don't know. Like, I want, the thing I want to say recklessly to you guys is be abnormal. Be abnormal. You know, like, it's when someone says, "Oh, you're so crazy," I think a rebuttal would be, "Oh, you're so normal." You know, like, yeah.
thank you so much.
Okay. Okay.
Great. Well, we have refreshments. Where? We need a minute. Okay, we need a minute. There will be refreshments. Yeah. Thank you, Jimenez. This is amazing.
Should I turn this off?
Super
Or?
good. Oh,